The world says money is simple: earn, spend, save. But what if prosperity was never about money at all? Here we uncover the contradictions that shape how we think, act, and feel about wealth. Welcome to the Prosperity Paradox podcast, where every story challenges what you believe about success. The strange thing about money is this: it makes people run even when they have no idea where the finish line is. This story begins on a morning when a man finally realized he had been sprinting toward a destination he never chose. Elias Brennan was the kind of person people described as driven. His colleagues said it like a compliment, his family said it like a warning, and he said it to himself like a promise. A promise that one day, if he just ran fast enough, he would arrive. But on that Tuesday morning, something in him broke the spell. He stood on the 32nd floor balcony of the office tower where he worked, a glass and steel monument to ambition, watching the city buzz like a chaotic machine. People rushed across crosswalks with coffees in hand, cars honked in impatient bursts, and somewhere below a construction drill rattled the concrete. It was a sound he had heard 1,000 times. But that morning, it felt different. It felt like a mirror, always loud, always urgent, always pushing. He realized suddenly how rare it was for him to simply stop, to stand still, to breathe, to not already be thinking about the next meeting, the next email, the next step on the invisible ladder he'd been climbing with such desperation. Elias touched the railing. Cold metal. And for the first time in years, he allowed himself to feel the weight of his own exhaustion. Not the physical kind, the existential kind. The kind that sinks into your bones when your entire life becomes a race you don't remember signing up for. He whispered to himself, "What am I even chasing?" The city answered with silence. The paradox of hurry. From the outside, Elias looked like the model of financial momentum. He worked fast. He talked fast. He solved problems fast. He lived by a private script that had governed his entire adulthood. If I move quickly, I will earn quickly. If I earn quickly, I will succeed quickly. And once I succeed, I will finally slow down. That was the lie, because no matter how much he achieved, the finish line kept shifting further away, like a mirage on desert sand. It wasn't success he was chasing. It was the feeling of finally enough, and no amount of speed seemed to bring it closer. And that was the first realization of the paradox he was about to step into. The faster he ran, the poorer he felt. The poorer he felt, the faster he ran. The breaking point. Inside the building, the office was already humming with early birds. Screens lighting up, keyboards tapping like anxious fingertips, people shuffling papers with the same restless rhythm. Everyone in the industry seemed to share the rhythm of people living slightly ahead of themselves. But Elias didn't walk in. He stayed in the hallway, leaning against the cold marble wall, feeling the unfamiliar sensation of stillness and panic. You would think slowing down would feel peaceful. It doesn't at first. At first, it feels like drowning because the noise outside stops and the noise inside has nowhere left to hide. In that quiet, Elias felt something old rising up. A fear he had buried under years of rushing, a fear of stopping, a fear of being left behind, a fear of discovering that without the constant motion, he didn't know who he was. He tried to steady himself, but his hands trembled, not dramatically, just enough for him to finally notice. And noticing was the beginning. The world that never slows. He returned to the balcony, watching the stream of people below. Thousands of lives synchronized to the same frenzied tempo. Everyone speeding towards something with their heads down, not because they were late, but because they were afraid of falling behind. It hit him suddenly painfully. Maybe we don't rush because the world demands it. Maybe we rush because everyone else is rushing and we're terrified of being the only one who isn't. He remembered a sentence he once read in a forgotten book. If you sprint through life, you never see the doors that only open when you walk. At the time, he thought it was poetic nonsense, but now, standing in the cold morning air, it felt like someone had written it specifically for him, for this moment. For this awakening he never asked for, but desperately needed. The first still moment of his adult life. For the next 10 minutes, Elias didn't move. Not because he was deciding something, not because he was planning, but because he realized that this stillness was something he had avoided for decades. And then something unexpected happened. He noticed things. The softness of the wind touching the side of his face, the distant echo of a dog barking, a cyclist weaving between cars with an ease that felt almost joyful, a woman on the street laughing into her phone as if she had all the time in the world. It was like someone had turned the saturation up on life. He wondered, has the world always been like this? Or did I only now begin to see it? There was no epiphany, no dramatic realization, just a quiet truth rising through the noise. He had been moving too fast to hear his own life, and for the first time in years he whispered a different kind of promise, one with no deadlines, no metrics, no pressure. I need to slow down. He didn't know it yet, but this small, fragile sentence would change everything that came after. Not because slowing down would make him richer, but because slowing down would make him aware, and awareness is where prosperity is born. On that balcony, under the early light of a restless city, Elias Brennan did something extraordinary. He stopped running, and for the first time he started seeing. Elias didn't go back to his desk that morning. He walked past rows of glass-walled offices, past the buzz of people grinding through their routines, and ended up in a small conference room no one used before 9 a.m. He closed the door quietly. The world fell still again. For a moment he just stood there, leaning against the table, breathing slowly the way someone breathes after outrunning something invisible. Except Elias was beginning to understand. He hadn't outrun anything. He'd been chased, not by deadlines, not by expectations, but by something older, something deeper. Fear, the fear he never named. Elias sank into one of the chairs, the cheap plastic creaking beneath him. His heartbeat slowed. But a different kind of tension rose, the kind that comes when you finally run out of distractions. In the silence, a memory surfaced, uninvited, sharp as cold air. He was 8 years old, sitting at a dinner table in a cramped kitchen. His mother was calculating bills under a yellow, flickering light. His father sat quietly, staring at a red overdue notice as if the ink itself carried weight. They weren't shouting, they rarely shouted. But the silence was thick with scarcity, a silence that children understand even before they understand money. Elias remembered the sound of his mother's pencil tapping the table. Steady at first, then faster, then shaking. He didn't know it then, but that was the moment a belief was planted in him. If you don't move fast enough, everything can fall apart. It wasn't taught to him. It was absorbed like humidity, like smoke. And in the small conference room decades later, Elias felt the same tightness in his chest he felt that night as a boy. That fear never left. It only changed shape. Success built on scarcity. People think ambition comes from dreams, but most ambition, the kind that exhausts people, comes from fear. Fear of not having enough, fear of not being enough, fear of returning to the version of life we escaped from. Elias had built his entire adult identity around outrunning that fear. That's why he worked harder than everyone. Why he said yes to things he didn't care about. Why he obsessed over saving, earning, optimizing, climbing. Not because he loved the climb, but because he feared the fall. It's a different kind of poverty, a psychological one, a poverty of safety, of trust, of peace, a poverty that makes people mistake speed for security. Elias whispered into the empty room, "I'm still running from things that happened 20 years ago." The room had no reply, but the silence agreed with him. Fear speeds you up, wisdom slows you down. He rested his elbows on his knees and stared at the floor, a single sentence looping in his mind like a haunting refrain. Why am I still afraid? He wasn't broke anymore. He wasn't helpless. He wasn't trapped. And yet the fear felt just as loud now as it did in that kitchen decades ago. That's the paradox people rarely talk about. Fear doesn't disappear when you make money. Fear just upgrades its reasons. When you're poor, you fear not having enough. When you're comfortable, you fear losing what you finally gained. When you're wealthy, you fear falling behind those who are wealthier. Fear always finds a new costume. And as long as fear leads, speed becomes survival. The childhood blueprint. Most people inherit their financial behavior without realizing it. They inherit the pace of their parents' breath during crises. The tone in their voice when talking about bills, the way they reacted to uncertainty, that becomes the blueprint for adulthood. Elias remembered watching his father fix broken appliances instead of replacing them. He remembered his mother saving leftover aluminum foil. He remembered the subtle panic that entered the room whenever the phone rang past 8 p.m. Scarcity wasn't a number. It was a mood that settled into Elias's bones so deeply that even when he escaped the circumstances, he couldn't escape the tempo of urgency, the tempo of fear. And now, for the first time in years, he was hearing that tempo clearly and recognizing it for what it was, a ghost, a leftover frequency from a previous life, the cost of running too fast. Elias lifted his head and looked at the clock on the wall. 8:43 a.m. He should have been in a meeting. He should have been reviewing a report. He should have been replying to emails. But the truth hit him hard. He had spent so many years rushing toward the future that he never examined the past that was pushing him. He realized something else, something uncomfortable. His success wasn't built on confidence. It was built on trying to silence a fear that refused to die. And fears built in childhood are stubborn. They don't fade when the bank account grows. They fade when the story changes. But the story can't change if you're always moving too fast to read it. The unraveling, he leaned back in the chair and exhaled, a slow, shaky breath that felt like the first honest thing he'd done in years. He realized he didn't need to work faster or harder or smarter. He needed to understand why his decisions felt rushed, why his victories felt temporary, why his goals felt borrowed, why he never felt safe, even when he objectively was. Fear had been his compass for too long, and fear, when left unchallenged, always points in one direction: forward, faster. Never inward, slower. In that small conference room, under fluorescent lights and stale office air, Elias faced an unsettling truth. He wasn't driven. He was scared. And until he slowed down long enough to confront that fear, he would never feel wealthy, no matter how much he earned. Elias didn't plan to meet anyone that day. He didn't plan anything at all, which was strange for a man whose entire life had been a sequence of plans stacked on top of fears, disguised as ambition. He left the building during his lunch break, not because he was hungry, but because the walls felt too close, too familiar, too much like the inside of a life he no longer wanted to rush through. He wandered without purpose, letting the city guide him instead of chasing whatever he used to call productivity. For years he had walked these streets with tunnel vision. Today he noticed details he had never given permission to exist. The uneven rhythm of footsteps, the soft hum of cafe conversations, the gentle clatter of cutlery and laughter shaped by the wind. He walked until he found himself in a small park tucked between two old brick buildings, a place he must have passed 100 times without ever really seeing. A bench sat beneath an elm tree, its leaves trembling in the early afternoon light. And on that bench sat an older man feeding pieces of bread to a cluster of pigeons. The scene felt almost symbolic, quiet, grounded, unrushed. Elias sat on the other end of the bench, careful not to disturb the moment. But the older man turned to him anyway and smiled, the kind of smile that didn't rush to fill space, but allowed silence to stretch without anxiety. "You look like someone who hasn't breathed in a while," the man said. It wasn't a question, it was an observation, and it landed with uncanny accuracy. Elias exhaled, a little embarrassed. "Long morning," he said. The man chuckled softly. "I've known mornings like that. Usually they come after years of too many fast days." The sentence lingered in the air. Something about it felt intentional. "How did you know?" Elias asked. The man tossed another piece of bread to the pigeons. "They only break when you ignore them long enough." The mentor he didn't expect. The man introduced himself as Rowan, retired, widowed, and, in his words, finally living slowly enough to enjoy the things my younger self sprinted past. Elias didn't mean to open up. He wasn't the type. But something about Rowan's tone, calm, spacious, patient, made truth feel safe. He told Rowan about the balcony, the shaking hands, the sudden awareness of a life lived at maximum speed. Rowan listened without interrupting, the way old trees listen to storms. When Elias finished, Rowan nodded thoughtfully. "Most people think slowing down means falling behind," Rowan said quietly. "But sometimes slowing down is the only way to catch up." Elias frowned slightly. "Catch up to what?" "To yourself." Rowan said it so simply, but it hit Elias like the answer to a question he didn't know he'd been asking. Slow is not delay. Slow is precision. Rowan leaned back against the bench, hands folded, eyes drifting toward the branches above them. "Fast decisions often look smart because they feel decisive," he said, "but they hide the truth. Speed is usually just fear wearing a brave face. Elias felt his chest tighten not painfully, but in the way people feel something important and uncomfortable at the same time. Rowan continued, "When you move slower, you see clearer. And when you see clearer, you choose better. And when you choose better, you don't need as many choices." That line stayed with Elias. Slow eliminates noise. Slow reveals patterns. Slow turns life from reaction into intention. It was the opposite of everything he'd been taught, the opposite of everything he'd practiced. He stared at the pigeons gathering around Rowan's shoes. "Doesn't going slow make you less competitive?" Elias asked. Rowan shook his head gently. "You're confusing speed with accuracy. The world doesn't reward the fastest. The world rewards the ones who move with intention." Something softened in Elias, the tightly wound coil inside him loosening, if only a bit. Rowan turned to him fully now. "You think slowing down will cost you opportunities," he said. "But the truth is the opposite. Slowing down lets you see the opportunities you've been too fast to notice." Elias swallowed. It felt like Rowan was reading pages of a book Elias didn't remember handing him. "But how do you actually slow down?" Elias asked. There was vulnerability in the question, a quiet confession. Rowan smiled gently. "You start by listening to the things you've been drowning out, the lost art of presence." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind rustled the leaves. A child somewhere behind them laughed. A dog barked in the distance. Elias realized how much life you can hear when you're not racing past it. Rowan reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn notebook. He handed it to Elias. "I used to be you," Rowan said, "always racing, always chasing. Until I realized I wasn't chasing success, I was chasing silence, the quiet you only find when you stop running." Inside the notebook were simple, handwritten reminders. Walk slower today. Notice something you usually ignore. Ask your mind what it's afraid of. Pause before answering anything. Breathe before deciding anything. Let a moment be just a moment. No strategies, no productivity hacks, just presence. Rowan stood up, dusted crumbs from his coat, and said something that would echo in Elias's mind long after the man walked away. "Life isn't asking you to hurry, your fear is, and fear doesn't know the way forward, but presence does." He tapped Elias's shoulder gently. "Slow is not lazy," he said. "Slow is deliberate." Then he walked away, unhurried, unbothered, and profoundly peaceful. The first quiet shift. Elias stayed on the bench long after Rowan disappeared into the street. He looked through the notebook again, feeling something stir inside him, not excitement, not relief, but clarity. For years he had been moving so fast that he mistook motion for progress. But Rowan had given him something he didn't realize he was starving for: permission. Permission to move at the speed of awareness. Permission to think with precision instead of panic. Permission to live a life that wasn't shaped by fear. For the first time, Elias wondered, not how do I get ahead, but something far more radical. What if going slow is the real advantage? He closed the notebook, placed it on his chest, and breathed deeply, consciously, deliberately. And as he stood up to leave the park, the world didn't feel like a race anymore. It felt like something he was finally beginning to hear. Elias returned home that evening, carrying nothing but Rowan's small notebook, yet it felt heavier than any briefcase he'd ever brought back from the office. He set it down on the kitchen counter, next to the untouched stack of mail and the half-drunk cup of coffee he'd forgotten to finish that morning. The apartment was quiet, almost too quiet. But for the first time, the silence didn't feel hostile. It felt like space. Space to see, space to ask questions he had never slowed down long enough to ask. He opened the notebook again. The first line read, "Walk slower today." So he did. He walked from the kitchen to the living room, deliberately. He felt the floorboards under his feet, noticed the faint hum of the refrigerator, saw the streaks of sunset on the opposite wall. It was absurd and yet strangely grounding. He realized he had been sprinting through even the smallest parts of his life, walking fast, talking fast, even thinking fast. He wasn't living, he was rushing, and rushing had become his identity. Doing less, but deeper. Elias sat on the couch and let his eyes wander across the room. For years, his home had been a place he slept, not a place he lived. There were books he'd bought but never read, a guitar he once promised himself he'd learn but never touched, pictures from trips he barely remembered because even on vacation his mind had been calculating the next step. He whispered to the empty room, "How many moments have I abandoned just because they didn't move fast enough?" There was no answer, only the awareness of how much he had missed. He pulled out his laptop to check his calendar for the next day. It was filled with meetings he didn't care about, tasks that didn't matter, and commitments made by a version of himself who believed that saying yes was the path to success. He hovered over the delete button for several seconds, then click. One meeting disappeared, then another, then another. He didn't delete everything he wasn't escaping. He was choosing. Rowan's words echoed in his mind. When you choose better, you don't need as many choices. Removing the noise. The next morning, Elias woke up before his alarm. He didn't know why. Maybe it was the first time he hadn't gone to sleep with anxiety still flickering in his chest. He made coffee slowly, not rushed, not multitasking, just standing there listening to the quiet hiss of the kettle. That was new. He picked up the notebook again, paused before answering anything. He tried it with his phone, a message from a colleague. "Can you take this project? It's urgent." In the past, he would have replied instantly. Speed was his armor. Quick responses made him feel competent, indispensable. He paused, he breathed, he asked himself, "Do I want this, or am I afraid to say no?" For the first time in years, he typed, "I'm not able to take this on right now." He hit send, and nothing catastrophic happened. The world didn't collapse. His value didn't drop. The silence after sending that message felt like freedom. The paradox of less. As days passed, something unexpected began to shift, not externally, but within Elias. He started doing less, not because he was lazy, but because he was intentional. He discovered that when he took his time, his work was richer, deeper, more precise. He listened more carefully in meetings. He thought more clearly before speaking. He noticed things, small things that had always been drowned out by rushing. Patterns, opportunities, people's emotions, his own emotions, mates. What surprised him most wasn't that he was accomplishing more with less effort. It was that he finally felt present, and he wasn't living 3 steps ahead. He was living where his feet actually were. And presence has its own quiet intelligence, the kind that never appears when the mind is sprinting. Slowing down is stepping inward. One evening, Elias sat on his balcony again, the same place where everything began. But this time he wasn't overwhelmed. He was observant. The city was still noisy. Cars still honked. People still rushed. But Elias felt like he had stepped out of the current, like he was watching the river instead of being dragged by it. He thought about his childhood again, but the memories didn't sting the same way. He wasn't reliving them, he was understanding them. Fear may have shaped him, but it didn't have to lead him. He realized something profound in the quiet. Going slow wasn't about moving less. It was about feeling more, seeing more, choosing more. Slowing down wasn't stepping back from life. It was stepping inward into a deeper awareness he had never allowed himself to explore. Choosing what matters. That night he made a list, not of goals, not of achievements, but of things that actually mattered. Having time to think, having space to breathe, having conversations that weren't rushed, doing work that meant something, resting without guilt, living without constant noise. He looked at the list and felt something soften in him, a quiet recognition. These weren't luxuries, these were necessities, and he had lived most of his life without them. He understood now. Slowing down wasn't a retreat. It was a return to the parts of himself he abandoned in the rush to succeed. He sat back, closed his eyes, and let that realization settle. Tomorrow wouldn't be perfect. He would stumble. He would speed up again out of habit. He would forget. But the shift had already begun. He wasn't running from fear anymore. He was walking toward clarity. And clarity, he could feel it was leading him somewhere new, somewhere deeper, somewhere more meaningful, somewhere slow. Change rarely announces itself. It doesn't arrive with fireworks or dramatic music. It slips in quietly through small decisions, gentle pauses, and moments that seem insignificant until viewed in hindsight. For Elias, the shift began with mornings. He used to wake up already behind heart racing, mind buzzing, body bracing itself for another day of urgency. But now he woke up, slowly, sat on the edge of his bed, breathed, listened to the world before entering it. He didn't realize it at first, but this simple ritual was rewiring him. Fast-thinking Elias was reactive. Slow-thinking Elias was observant, and observation is where the world finally revealed itself. The power of clarity. Back at the office, Elias noticed things he'd never seen. A colleague who always looked exhausted, hiding it behind too loud jokes. Another who double-booked meetings, not because she was efficient, but because she was terrified of saying no. A manager who mistook stress for productivity. It wasn't judgment, it was recognition. He had been all of them at different times. Once you stop sprinting, you see the treadmill. Everyone else is stuck on the one you didn't even realize you were running. But the biggest shift wasn't in what he saw. It was in how he responded. Before, he would jump into every problem, fueled by the illusion that speed equaled competence. Now he let the first wave of reaction pass. He waited, he thought, he chose deliberately. To his surprise, his decisions became sharper, not louder, more accurate, not faster. Rowan's words echoed, "Slow is precision." He was finally starting to understand what that meant. The opportunities, hidden in the quiet one. Afternoon, Elias was reviewing a project with his team. It was something he'd overseen for months, a straightforward expansion proposal everyone believed was a sure thing. Everyone except Elias. As they presented the final numbers, he found himself zooming out, thinking not about the speed of execution, but the depth of understanding. Something felt off. Not dramatically, not obviously. Just quietly. He asked questions, slower ones, deeper ones. Within minutes, the team discovered an overlooked risk, small but significant enough to derail the entire initiative. A risk no one had noticed because everyone was too focused on meeting deadlines. Had Elias been his old self, he would have rushed the approval, trusting the momentum and ignoring the subtle details. But slowing down had given him a new sensor, one that detected nuance, tension, imbalance. The team fixed the issue, the project succeeded, and word spread through the office. Elias doesn't just move slower, he sees things, but it wasn't vision, it was presence. Opportunities, it turned out, didn't hide from people. People hid from opportunities by moving too fast to notice them. Life without the noise. The changes extended beyond work. He started cooking instead of ordering takeout. Not because it was healthier, but because it demanded presence chopping, tasting, adjusting. The quiet rhythm grounded him in the moment. He reconnected with an old friend over coffee and realized he hadn't truly listened to someone in years. Not with half his mind planning his next task, but fully, genuinely. He started journaling at night, not to be productive, but to be honest. Some entries were simple. I walked today without rushing. I said no and felt safe. I noticed the way sunlight hits my desk at 4 p.m. These weren't achievements, they were awakenings. In slowing down, he wasn't becoming less. He was becoming whole. The return of something lost one evening. Elias visited the park where he met Rowan, hoping to see him again. He didn't, but he sat on the same bench, under the same elm tree, listening to the same soft tremble of leaves. He wondered what Rowan would say if he could see him now. Maybe he'd say nothing, just smile that patient smile. Or maybe he'd say, "You've begun." Elias felt it. The shift wasn't in the world. It was in him. His thoughts were no longer frantic. His breath was no longer tight. He felt anchored, not in achievement, not in wealth, but in awareness. And awareness has a way of revealing truths that speed always hides, seeing the real currency. That night, as he walked home, Elias looked around the city, the same city he once saw as a battleground. Now it felt softer, not less chaotic, but less threatening. He watched a couple strolling hand in hand, moving at half the pace of everyone around them. He watched a busker playing guitar softly on a street corner. He watched a man pause to tie his daughter's shoelace while the crowd streamed past them. He realized they weren't slow. They were alive, fully, deeply, unapologetically. He whispered to himself, I never understood what wealth really was. It wasn't speed. It wasn't accumulation. It wasn't status. It was space. Space to choose, space to breathe, space to live without fear guiding every decision. Prosperity, he realized, wasn't measured in numbers. It was measured in clarity. And clarity only comes to those who slow down long enough to see. The world hadn't changed at all. He had, and everything quietly, steadily shifted because of it. The final shift didn't happen on a dramatic day. It happened on an ordinary morning, the kind of morning Elias once sprinted through without ever noticing. He woke before sunrise, no alarm, no panic, just a quiet sense of being awake inside a life that finally felt like his. He made coffee, opened the window, and let the cold air brush against his face. The city was still half asleep, muted, gentle, breathing. For years he had believed wealth came from moving faster than everyone else. Now he knew wealth came from having mornings like this, unhurried, unclaimed, undivided. A moment that belonged entirely to him. He took a sip of coffee and felt a thought rise soft but solid. This is what I was running toward all along. Not success, not approval, not status, peace, clarity, presence. A life lived deliberately, not desperately. When the world no longer sets the tempo. Elias walked to work that morning, not fast, not slow, just present. He noticed how different the world felt when he wasn't trying to outrun it. The sidewalks weren't obstacles, they were invitations. The crowds weren't threats, they were stories. Even the noise felt less sharp, like background music instead of pressure. Inside the office tower, nothing had changed. People still rushed, screens still glowed, deadlines still demanded obedience. But Elias had changed, and when you change your pace, you change your perception. He no longer felt the invisible tug that once pulled him into urgency. He no longer felt like he needed to prove anything. He carried a steadiness, a kind of internal gravity. One of his co-workers asked, half joking, "Why do you always look so calm lately? Did you win the lottery or something?" Elias smiled. "Something like that," he said quietly. But he hadn't won money. He had won space. And space, he now understood, was the rarest currency in the modern world. The test. A few weeks later, a major opportunity appeared, a high-stakes project that could elevate Elias's position, income, and reputation. The old Elias would have said yes instantly, eager to prove his worth. But now he paused. He asked himself the question Rowan had etched into his mind. Is this fear or intention? He reviewed the proposal not for the prestige, but for the truth. Would it enhance his life or consume it? Would it align with his new pace or drag him back into the current he had finally escaped? The answer surprised him. He said no, not because he wasn't capable, not because he lacked ambition, but because he finally understood the cost of saying yes to everything. He chose depth over noise, presence over pressure, his life over his fear. That decision marked the moment Elias realized he had truly changed. People around him saw it too. He wasn't moving less. He was moving differently. With intention. With clarity. With a quiet confidence that didn't need to shout to exist. Returning to the bench, one Saturday, Elias returned to the park, the place where everything had begun to shift. The elm tree still stood there, leaves dancing softly in the breeze. The bench was empty this time. No Rowan. No pigeons. But Elias sat down anyway. He opened the notebook Rowan had given him, now worn, dog-eared, filled with notes in the margins. He added a new line. Slow isn't a pace, it's a way of being. He looked up at the branches above him and felt a quiet gratitude. Rowan hadn't given him answers. He had given him awareness, and awareness was the first step toward freedom. He wondered where Rowan was now, maybe traveling, maybe sitting in another park somewhere, maybe helping another stranger slow down long enough to hear their own life. Wherever he was, Elias hoped he knew the impact he had left, the full circle. As Elias walked home, a realization surfaced, one so simple yet so profound, he stopped in his tracks. He thought back to the balcony, the panic, the shaking hands, the sense of a life collapsing under its own speed. He thought back to his childhood, the fear that had shaped his every move. He thought back to Rowan, the notebook, the first quiet shift. And then it hit him. All his life he had been trying to get there, but there was no end point. The only place he ever needed to arrive was here, this moment, this awareness, This version of himself, deliberate, present, unhurried. This was the real destination he had been running past for decades. He closed his eyes and let that truth settle in his chest like a warm stone. The final realization. That evening, he sat on his balcony again, the same spot where everything began. The city buzzed below, but it no longer dictated the pace of his thoughts. He breathed deeply, feeling the weight of his journey, the mistakes, the fears, the awakenings, the transformations. He smiled, not triumphantly, but peacefully. He understood now why slowing down had changed everything, because slowing down wasn't about time. It was about awareness, about presence, about finally stepping into a life that wasn't shaped by fear or urgency. The real paradox, the one he had lived, not learned, was this. When you stop rushing toward wealth, you begin to create it. Not through speed, but through clarity. Not through force, but through intention. Not through running, but through seeing. He looked out at the city lights and whispered the truth he had been moving toward this entire time. Maybe wealth was never about money at all. And in that moment, unhurried, grounded, fully awake, he finally felt rich.